I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe, Josh Kraushaar, and Sarah Mucha. Ed is a CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Josh is the author of the Against the Grain column and a podcast host for the National Journal. And Sarah is a political reporter at Axios. Welcome. It's good to have you all. Ed, first of all, let's start with the latest on the federal response to those tornadoes that devastated the U.S. over the weekend. What do we know about that federal response?
Well, we know that it continues and really began in earnest on Saturday morning as the president continued to get updates through the weekend. And again, today here at the Oval Office, meeting with the Homeland Security Secretary, the FEMA director, and others to go over what exactly will be needed. So far, he's only signed emergency declarations for Kentucky and Illinois. They're waiting to see whether any other state applies for federal assistance. And we know now the president is headed to Kentucky on Wednesday to assess the storm damage himself. He'll get a big storm briefing in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and then head to Mayfields, the center of this storm, where so much of the devastation and the death unfortunately occurred. He's been in constant touch with Governor Beshear of Kentucky, has spoken with the other state leaders as well, and FEMA is continuing to surge equipment and whatever other supplies are requested into that part of the country. And in a sign of how positive the sort of feedback has been so far, at least, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky said earlier today on the Senate floor these are the worst storms in his life to hit his home state, and he appreciates the quick response from the Biden administration.
Yeah, it is incredible to think about how vast that swath of destruction is, especially if you've covered tornadoes. To see that wide of an area is really remarkable. Josh, let's turn to the international front. Where do negotiations between the U.S. and Russia stand right now? Because today, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that deploying U.S. troops is on the table should Russia invade Ukraine.
Yeah, that's an important rhetorical step up from the Biden administration, which has previously focused on diplomacy and even trying to, accommodate maybe some of the interests of Russia without getting to allow them to invade the Ukraine. There's a real concern in the White House about Russia's intentions. The White House is trying to use diplomacy as a first resort, but putting that military option on the table is a big, significant step. I think there's some worry that Putin senses the West's weakness, the divisions within the European community, the war weariness, frankly, in the American electorate, and that's shaping national security prerogatives. There's a real guessing game on what Putin plans to do among American national security officials. So that on one hand, he's massing troops, and then there's suggestions that he's trying to prepare for a war against Ukraine. On the other hand, starting a war would entail a large number of Russian casualties and even jeopardize the country economically and risk the Nord Stream pipeline that the country just cut with the European governments. So, this is a lot of uncertainty, and the fact that the White House is ramping up the rhetoric is a sign of how concerned they are.
Well, Sarah, it's a big week in Congress. The Senate has to figure out raising the debt ceiling and approving the National Defense Authorization Act, in addition to trying to pass the Biden administration's massive social spending plan. What are the top sticking points on the spending bill?
Sure. Well, like you mentioned, I think the very first thing that we have to look at whether or not they can get this done by Christmas is that they have to raise the debt ceiling and they have to pass an NDAA. So they already have so much on their plate. But as of an hour ago, Chuck Schumer said that he still believes that Christmas is that deadline, that they can get it passed before they go home for the holidays. They're looking at a few things, though, right? First of all, someone who we have spoken a lot about on this show is Senator Joe Manchin. He has yet to commit to a vote, and he's concerned about inflation, for one, among several other sort of items about, increasing spending and what that could do for the economy. They also still have to work out some sticking points on SALT, that's a tax cap, and paid leave, among several other kind of smaller issues. And then on top of that, it still needs to go through the parliamentarian who's going to rule on whether or not certain provisions can be included in the bill. So they still have a lot to work through to make it through that optimistic Christmas deadline, for sure.
Yeah, and Ed, I want to get your take. I mean, what are you hearing about Senator Manchin and where he stands right now on this spending package? And, realistically, is there any way that this passes before Christmas?
Well, I think that depends a bit on how exactly a phone call that he is having with the president this afternoon goes, and whether we get a sense of how many sort of things remain on the senator's list of grievances or concerns with the Build Back Better agenda, and whether there's a real chance of getting it done by Christmas Eve, or whether it's going to have to wait into next year. White House officials were asked about that possibility today of it getting pushed into next year. They refused to go there. Of course, there is one big urgent element of the Build Back Better bill, and that is the expiration of child tax credits that would be renewed if the legislation is passed by the end of the year. Wouldn't commit to possibly passing just an extension of that tax cut on its own, saying that they are focused on passing the ambitious legislation. But the president and the senator, Joe and Joe, are supposed to speak this afternoon by telephone, not in person, to discuss the moderate senator's remaining concerns about what to expect. And the White House tells us that the president, is engaged in all sorts of conversations this week with lawmakers, as are the aides and legislative experts that have been engaged all year long. But as one of them said to me, the president can do math, and he knows that he needs that +1, Joe Manchin, in order to get anything through the Senate.
All right. Well, Josh, an appeals court ruled against former President Trump's latest attempt to prevent the House January 6th committee from seeing documents. What does that tell us about where this case might go from here?
Well, it looks like it'll go to the Supreme Court after Trump's appeal. And this was a unanimous ruling by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which suggests that the January 6th committee has a pretty strong case in terms of accessing these important documents. But, the Trump strategy, I think, is less legal and more political. They're trying to run out the clock. When you talk to Trump officials, they see the likelihood of Republicans taking back the House after 2022 or in the run-up to the midterms, and they think that the committee is really working on a pretty compressed timetable, a year max to get all these documents, to really hold the hearings, to get everything done. And what the Trump folks and allies are doing is trying to use the legal process to delay, and run out the clock before the January 6th committee can really get their full report out. So, this is going to go to the court. It's probably going to go to the Supreme Court. But the bigger issue, I think, is less legal and more political, namely the timetable that the January 6th committee is working under.
Yeah, and Josh, to go one step further, why is that about a year-long time frame? It's because of the midterms.
It's the midterms. Everything becomes political come next year. Everyone's thinking about their next re-election campaign. It's a very important issue that's going to dominate Washington as the committee unearths more information and holds hearings. But ultimately, a lot of lawmakers are caring about their re-elections, and the interest of voters is more about the economy and more about their own self-interest back home. So it's going to be a tricky dance, even among Democrats who are really leading the charge against Trump and for transparency and what happened behind the scenes on January 6th. It's going to be challenging to both focus on the issues that voters are caring about and one of the most important issues in Washington about getting to the bottom of everything.
Meantime, Sarah, CNN reports 81-year-old House Speaker Nancy Pelosi will run for re-election in 2022 and may even try to keep a leadership position. What do we know about her plans?
Well, I think what we know for sure and what we can say for sure is that it's politically savvy to say that you're going to run for re-election, even if you aren't. So whether or not she is, we don't have that reporting at Axios necessarily. However, it makes the most sense for her to say that she's going to, because she doesn't want to be what's called a lame duck. She wants to be able to hold that same power that she still had. And if she is considered to be running, then that same power sort of stays with her. If she doesn't, there are a few people lined up already, sort of rumors that have been spreading around for at least a year or two now of who could replace her. That's Congressman Hakeem Jeffries is one top contender. And that's, of course, if Democrats were to win the House again in 2022, which is still yet to be determined, obviously. And then if Hakeem Jeffries runs up against some opposition, people are also throwing out Catherine Clark. She's a congresswoman from Massachusetts in the Boston, Cambridge area. And folks have been saying, where Speaker Pelosi may not be as focused on mentoring younger members of Congress, Catherine Clark has sort of made that her mantle. And while she would not publicly say that she wants the position or that she's running for the position, many aides around the Capitol are saying, that's sort of her play to get in, is by mentoring all of these younger members of Congress, and then eventually maybe they will vote for her for the speakership.
Interesting. Very, very delicate positioning and public statements there. All right. So, Ed, speaking of open questions, today at the White House press briefing, you asked Press Secretary Jen Psaki about who might be running in 2024. Here's some of that exchange.
The White House's message is we're focused right now on what the American people elected the president to do just over a year ago, which is to get COVID under control, to put people back to work, and to help give people some breathing room. And we hope other people keep their focus on that as well.
Should they knock it off? Is that speculation helpful?
The president has every intention of running for re-election, so that's the other message for them.
All right, Ed. So who could be on the Democratic ticket in 2024?
Well, let's make very clear. This was sparked by yet another round of reporting in other outlets about the fears of Democrats and whether there needs to be a plan B in the event that the 79-year-old Joe Biden, who would be 82 just after Election Day 2024, is able to run, and whether his Vice President Kamala Harris will have the political clout and ability to run if he doesn't. Who's possibly thinking about it based on these reports? There's a handful of governors and senators, some of whom ran before, that are said to be open to the idea if need be. But my desire in asking that was, this has got to be grating to a White House that now has said at least 4 times in the last several months he's running for re-election. To hear now not just the news media asking these questions, but Democrats openly participating in the speculation and stoking it and getting names out there. That's got to be infuriating to this president and his political team. So you saw Psaki there say, look, he's running for re-election, so maybe you should just hold off.
Yeah, especially at a time when the president is trying to push through, right, at this very, sensitive time with the clock running out at the end of the year. He's trying to get his agenda through. And so hence the context. I'm glad you filled that in for us. Well, Josh, meanwhile, former President Trump had trouble drawing a crowd to his first event with Bill O'Reilly. What potentially might that mean for a possible 2024 bid?
Well, look, we've all kind of assumed that Trump is going to be the nominee, he's going to run, and he's dominating over the party. But there's some smoke signals that his grip on the party isn't quite what it was when he was in office. You noted the Bill O'Reilly event where it was far from sold out, a lot of empty seats there. There's some primaries that are coming up in the month of May. Trump is overextending himself. He got involved in an Alabama Senate race behind Congressman Mo Brooks, who is struggling in his race. He had to contend with his favored Senate candidate in Pennsylvania, Sean Parnell, dropping out of the race amid allegations from his ex-wife of domestic abuse. There's some holes in the Trump political operation, and while he still does command a lot of loyalty with Republican voters, he may be overextending himself, and there's some signs that his touch in these primaries isn't quite as golden as it was when he was president. So there are going to be some contests coming up next year, early next year, that are going to really test Trump's political clout. There's some signs that maybe this could be the first phase where he's not quite as dominant as a lot of us talking heads have said in the past.
All right, Ed, Josh, and Sarah, thank you all very much.